Hey, what's up everybody? This is Tattoo Bart and welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we are gonna go over some of the most common shading techniques that are used in tattooing today. But first, of course, we need to know why shading actually matters. Shading is kind of like the heart and soul that you put into a tattoo to make that tattoo come alive. Line work is absolutely amazing. It's a good foundation for a tattoo, but most of the time they just look flat unless you create lines to create some sort of shading kind of effect. But yes, just line work is usually a very flat image, and shading will create more dimension into your tattoo and make it a more interesting piece overall. So like I said before, we are going to go over 4 techniques that you can use to create shading in your tattoo design. So let's go to the first one. The first one is going to be whip shading, which is my favorite one. You kind of start from your starting point and slowly whip out towards the end of your shading. Here you can see that with ink on my needle, it is very important to move at a little bit of a higher pace or run your machine a little bit slower so you can move your hand slower. So here we gotta look from another angle. You just start from your starting point and slowly whip out towards where you want your shading to end. You can also see here, you can do that with every shading, is hit your shading from different angles. It's kind of like cross hatching. This will create a little bit more smoothness in your shading and won't show as much direction in the shading if you don't want that to show in your shading, of course. Whip shading is probably better to use in smaller areas like old school designs or small pieces that you want to shade. This is not a very good technique to use for very large transitions. And you should end up with something like this. Let's move on to technique number 2. This is a very popular shading technique to use. You are kind of using the same motion as a pendulum would swing. So you're going into the skin, going out, in and out towards the edges, which will give you a very soft edge on your shading and will generally make your shading a lot softer. Now, practicing the technique on this shading technique is very crucial. It is very hard to press too hard, so I would always recommend to use a very gentle touch and kind of, while you're moving away from your shading, make your motions a little bit larger, and that will also create a nicer transition in your shading. In short areas where you brush, they will often get a lot darker, so make sure you don't overwork the skin. Make nice soft motions, don't press too hard onto the skin, and kind of play around with your hand speed. And as you can see, this shading looks a lot softer than whip shading. For our next technique, we are going to need a liner. So we're going to take out our Magnum and put in a 3-round liner. And I always like to stick out my needle a little bit more. And you might want to turn your voltage down a little bit more from whenever you're using a Magnum, because we are going to do some dot work or pepper shading. What you want to do is move very slowly across the skin and just barely touch the skin with that liner. As you can see here. Now, the faster you move, the more these dots are going to be apart. So make sure you really get your hand speed and your machine speed in sync, and always slow down your machine when you need to. Don't rush through the tattoo, just slow your machine down if you need it to be. Now, doing this kind of shading technique, you will see a lot of direction in your shading, which basically means that you can see which way you are moving. So make sure you hit your shading from different angles to hide that. Some people prefer to make them dots by hand and kind of create that pattern like this. I also know people that later then go over with a Magnum. This is of course all okay. Here you can see a little bit more of that technique, just kind of using that pendulum swing or whip shading, or kind of combine both of these hand motions to create your dots. And make sure you just keep on hitting that from different directions, just so you don't get that direction showing in your tattoo, unless you want that, of course. But Generally speaking, you don't really want that. Keep in mind that whenever you are shading with a liner, it is very hard to kind of get frustrated because it looks like it is not going fast enough, but you have to stay very patient when you're lining with a liner. Don't start pushing harder, don't increase the voltage on your machine, just trust the process and take it easy. Just trust the process. After you did that, you should have something that looks like this. The fourth and last technique is going to be layering. Now we're going to need a bit more ink than just 1 cup. We're going to use a full black. We're going to use a half black. And for the last cup, we're going to use just 1 or 2 drops of ink. And we're going to dilute that with water, distilled water, rose water, shading solution, whatever you want to use. I'm just going to use water because we are working on practice skin. And what you basically want to do is start with your lightest shading solution that you have on your setup. And what you're going to do is create that lightest part of your shading first by just slowly brushing in that ink onto the skin. It is called feathering and layering for a reason, so make sure you touch that skin very soft, don't push too hard. You really have to take it easy because this shading technique takes a lot of time and you have to stay very patient in order to get a nice and smooth transition. So don't rush it, don't start moving faster, don't increase your voltage, just take it easy and softly just brush in that shading. Then once you have that first layer in, we're gonna move up in darkness a little bit. So we're gonna use our half black and sort of go a little bit behind that line and transition that into that light shading that we just created by just softly and very slowly brushing over the skin again. And that's why it is so important to go very soft and light, because you are going to hit areas multiple times and you don't want to overwork that skin. So just treat that skin very gentle, and yeah, don't smash that light ink in there because you are gonna overwork the skin and it's gonna destroy your shading. So once again, just take it easy, and if you need to, just slow down that machine. This shading technique is absolutely perfect if you have to make a very large transition, because you can use a lot of different gradients of ink to create that shading. We are using just 3 now, but you could use 5 or 7 different gradients to create a very smooth shading over a very large surface. And this is also why this shading technique is a lot or often used in realism. And then you will end up with a shading looking something like this. I can't stress this enough, it is always very important to use a really nice and slow voltage to start off with. The slower you run your machine, the more time you have to create a certain shade, and it'll make your shade a little bit softer as well. Now, as you could see, I am not the best person in that layering sort of effect. I hardly ever use it myself. So you can see that a little bit on the practice skin. That's why I don't really use it on clients, and it is very important to practice things on a practice skin first before you start experimenting. In this video you could have also seen it. You can use various of needles. You could use a liner to do shading, and you could of course use a magnum for shading. Of course there are better needles for certain techniques, like whip shading is preferably nice with a flat magnum because you get that nice harsh pepper shade sort of effect that you want in your old school sort of tattoos. Now, if you are doing a pendulum swing or that layering, feathering sort of shading, it is very important that you use a curved magnum, because that magnum is already a lot softer itself, and it'll give you a much nicer and soft effect in your shading. And obviously if you do dot work, you're gonna need something like a liner to create that dotted sort of effect. But also then it is very important to maybe run your machine a lot slower than what you do whenever you're shading with a magnum. Other than that, I really hope that you learned something from this video, and if you did, make sure to give me a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel. Other than that, I wish you all a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video.